good evening to all our joint participants to the fortnightly webinar series on the short list of climate actions that will work. Today's topic is wind and solar, but what else? The moderator for the webinar will be Mr. Reggie Kumar Pillai, President ISGF and Chairman Global Smart Energy Federation. And presenter for today's webinar is Mr. Michael Barnard, founder, The Future is Electric. The short list of climate actions that will work is a set of material Mr. Michael Barnard has spent 15 years developing, researching each major problem area and the proposed solutions for it. He assesses each with the triple filter of technical viability, economic competitiveness, and human acceptability. Trillions of dollars will be spent on decarbonization in the coming decades. Much of it will be spent unwisely, and much of climate action must be taken in nations that are not developed and affluent yet. Countries that embrace and lean into the short list will be more affluent, more resilient, healthier, and coincidentally do more for climate action. Countries that don't will suffer significant economic headwinds in the coming decades. In the first webinar of the series titled Electrify Everything Everywhere All at Once, Mr. Barnard presented the reasons why electrification is the best route for the decarbonizing. The recorded version of that webinar can be accessed at the ISGF's YouTube channel. The link is given in this presentation as well. In today's webinar, Mr. Barnard will assert the likely endgame mix of electricity generation on grids globally, characterizing generation types including co-benefits. While wind and solar will dominate, they have different aspects and dependencies. Before we dive into the webinar, a few important information for our participants. All participants are requested to be on mute and kindly do not unmute or turn on your cameras while the speaker is talking or presenting. You are requested that you can post your questions in the chat box. We will be compiling all the questions and taking them in the end of the webinar. With that, I would like to introduce Mr. Reggie Kumar Pillai, President ISGF, Chairman GSCF, as moderator of today's webinar. Mr. Pillai is internationally renowned expert with 4 decades of experience in the electricity sector in diverse functions covering the entire value chain and across continents. So without any further ado, I would like to hand over the stage to Mr. Reggie Kumar Pillai to take the webinar forward. Over to you, sir.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all the participants from around the globe. Welcome to the second edition of this webinar series. And today, Michael will talk about different electricity generation sources and what is the future of each one of them. Last week, I had gone for a conference in Dubai. The day 16, 17, 18 was the conference, and 16th morning, everything was ready. There are more than 1,000 exhibitors in Dubai World Trade Center. And the same day morning, it started raining. Nobody could predict that. And it was such a heavy rain that the whole exhibition place was flooded. And later in the afternoon, it again rained. So they had to postpone the conference by a day. The next same day evening, it rained again heavily. And people say that a portion of the roof of the exhibition center collapsed. So they had to cancel it. We don't know whether it is true or not, but it had to be, the whole event had to be canceled. And we got stuck and for 5 days, and with great difficulty from Abu Dhabi, had to take a ticket and come back to Dubai. Airport was also non-functional for a couple of days. We reached back after wasting a week on Sunday. As we speak, there is a huge dust storm from the Sahara deserts to the northern side, and the capital city of Greece, Athens, is completely covered in dust storm, and it looked like brownish or reddish in color. And Michael just said there is some storm in West Coast as well. So climate change is no more, it's no no more a topic of future. It is actually happening. Everybody is experiencing for the last decade or more, seawater rise, change in weather patterns, massive destruction of crops, flooding in different places, cyclones. Earlier, big cyclone used to happen in our region once in 5 years. Now, every year there are 3-4 big cyclones. So these are all reality. Yet, when you look at the statistics of last year's global power generation, the share of coal-based electricity generation has gone up only. Coal consumption overall has gone up. It has not come down. So that is a very sad, very, very sad situation. Just a few minutes ago, earlier in the day, I believe, EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, released a set of guidelines for power generation in North America, in USA by 2032. And one of the main thing, which under whose influence they have gone, I didn't read the whole thing. This came only a few minutes ago. So carbon capture and storage has been given a huge share for that. And just 2 minutes ago, I saw a tweet from Edison Electric Institute president that is a wrong decision, because CCS is a technology is not matured enough, and neither we have enough time in next 7 years. We will not be able to, they will not be able to do permitting and approval, financing and construction of CCS to that extent. So this is exactly the reason why this webinar series. Many new technologies, many people with partial knowledge or surface level knowledge, they get fascinated and make billions or trillions of dollars of investment, which doesn't yield. In many cases, it becomes counterproductive. So in today's webinar, you all know about last time we talked about electrify everything, and the generation should triple in next 3 to 4 decades. So we talked about that. And today, beyond solar and wind, Michael will be delving into the details of hydroelectric generation, coal generation, natural gas, and natural gas with cogeneration, biomass, nuclear, of course, wind and solar farms, wind onshore and offshore wind farms, solar farms, as well as distributed commercial and residential sector, geothermal, tidal, and on the storage and pump storage, as well as heat pumps will be covering. So I will hand over to Michael for the today's presentation. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Reggie, and the assembled ISGF team. Hello to everybody, wherever you are in the world, whatever time zone you're on. So originally I had assembled this particular set of material for a global investment bank. It's one of the larger ones. They'd asked me to speak to a global set of institutional investors. We're trying to figure out the signal from the noise about what types of generation would show up on grids in what percentages, so that they could start thinking strategically about their portfolios. What parts of their portfolio are at risk? What parts of their portfolio strategy and investment thesis should they start leaning into? And it remains useful for this context. So without further ado, I'm going to start through this, and I'll go through a whole bunch of different technologies and talk about what they're useful for, how big they'll be in the end game, regardless of how big they are now, and what that likely means. So let's start with the basics, hydroelectric. We've been doing it for a long time. In the future, it's going to be about 10% of all energy. And let's start there. Electricity is going to be the basis of all energy in the future. So we won't be burning stuff. We won't be digging up fossil fuels. We're probably not going to be making a lot of biofuels, except for long-haul aviation and long-haul shipping. Everything else will just electrify. And hydroelectric is going to remain a useful set of that grab bag, even though it's challenged by changes in precipitation. Part of the reason why coal went up last year was because there was a drought in Western China where the Three Gorges Dam is, and so they had to burn more coal to accommodate for the reduction in hydro generation. But if we think the Three Gorges Dam is big, well, China's building a dam 3 times the size in the mountains to the west of there. So we're still building a lot of hydroelectric. Now, capacity changes a lot. These tables, the context stays the same. So it has a bit of a capacity thing. It has a distance from demand centers, which becomes important as we think about where to put stuff. Generation type, synchronous versus asynchronous. Synchronous enables us to keep the grid on a steady heartbeat at steady hertz. Asynchronous provides us more flexibility and a smoother ramp up and ramp down curve. So that becomes important. Synchronous, we tend to want on high voltage alternating current. Asynchronous can be on HVAC or HVDC. And then we have the flexibility. Flexibility is a huge component these days of what we need on grids. We need firmed and flexible. We don't really need base load. We need firmed and flexible generation because wind and solar are intermittent. Now, hydro can do base load and peaking. Then there's cold benefits, that voltage and frequency regulation, which I mentioned, which tends to be on the high voltage alternating current grid, though that's replicable with electronics these days. We also get recreation, irrigation. We even get a fishing industry on some of the big hydro dams. But there are the constraints. So the seasonality of it is one. It tends to be more robust as a form of generation in the springtime. In a lot of geography, that balances well with wind being more robust in the fall time. So there's seasonality of different types of generation or that becomes important as we start thinking about balancing the curves across time. Personally, I think a lot of hydroelectric generation is just going to end up as passive batteries. We'll let nature fill it up for us, and we'll draw it down as required, depending upon lulls and other stuff. So it'll be less of something we use all the time, and more of something we use like modern gas and coal plants for peaking generation. So then we get to coal generation. No surprise, I project zero room for coal in the future of the generation grid. It's fairly inflexible. It's needs to be kind of gigawatt scale for thermal generation. The interesting thing right now is that as I look across the world's coal plants, I see significantly declining capacity factors. While they're designed to run at 90% plus capacity factors as baseload generation for the most part, if we take China's coal, while they have all these permitted plants, and they have 1.1 terawatt of power capacity of plants in operation, there's kind of two things that are important to know. One is the capacity factor of their coal plants is less than 50%. It is almost exactly the same capacity as the United States natural gas plants. In other words, they're operating it as peak demand power, not baseload power for their country. The nuance there is that as more and more renewables get built, and obviously China is building enormous amounts of renewables, that is going to decline even further. And there comes a point where the plants are not profitable. The data out of the finance industry of China indicates that while there's a lot of plants that have been permitted, financial institutions are very leery about actually financing them. So while coal plants in China may be getting all the news for permits, they're not getting money and they're not getting built. While I said there was 1.1 terawatts of power capacity there, they've also shut down 775 gigawatts of power capacity. That is 2/3 of what they have operating. They've either shut down operational plants, the older, worst ones, or they've removed the permits because they stopped making sense. They've shelved them, they've mothballed them, they've fully decommissioned plants. And so you can see there's some advantages there and some disadvantages. From a constraints, all thermal generation plants, the legacy ones, many of them are being challenged by the requirement for cooling water. The thermal design was required for the water to be a certain temperature so that it would actually cool everything down appropriately. But now the water is a lot hotter and they're getting into challenges, and frequently the water is just not there. So they can't cool at all. So the climate change is impacting a lot of the legacy coal generation plants and making permitting of new ones obviously more problematic. Then we get to natural gas. In the future, 1%, which might surprise some people, but let's put that in context. Natural gas, or methane at least, is a useful end game strategic reserve of electricity for really weird lulls, like the ones that occur every 10 to 50 years, where there's been a long period without the sun shining or the wind blowing, and a need for something else as a strategic reserve. But natural gas generation can also be biomethane generation. I project a future where strategic reserves of electricity will be provided by capturing the methane that's baking off our dairy barns, our landfills, our other sources of anthropogenic methane, and put into their strategic reserves instead of natural gas. So we'll be capturing a climate problem and storing it to solve an energy challenge, instead of just letting it leak to the atmosphere and be a climate problem. Natural gas generation, especially combined cycle, is pretty flexible, and it can be pretty close to human beings. It has high nitrous oxide emissions, precursor to smog that cause asthma in children. So not great to have right beside growing families, but it doesn't have to be, it's not as bad, nearly as bad as coal from a health impacts perspective. And it's got significant flexibility. It is a synchronous generation, so you have to spool it up. There aren't any co-benefits. You don't get voltage and frequency control. And especially in the past 3 or 4 years globally, what we've seen is massive gas price fluctuations. Structurally, this started in 2019 when the debt-laden US shale industry and fracking industry started hitting roadblocks. Their projections of length of service of fracked and unconventional oil wells were off. They were operating about a third the length that they'd projected in their prospectuses, and as a result, they were going bankrupt. And so, what we have is a situation where gas price fluctuations started being baked in. Then there was the OPEC, Saudi Arabian Russian oil war that was attacking unconventional oil extraction in 2021. That was impacting American shale oil as well, which is where they got 70% of their natural gas. So that was all structurally causing challenges historically with natural gas prices that have been stable for about 15, 18 years. Then Russia invaded Ukraine and the world's gas prices just spiked. And so, as we move forward, the actual cost of gas generation is going to continue to be structurally volatile. And so as we model out the cost of that energy, it's actually more expensive than we thought. And then, of course, there's the problem that methane along its distribution channel leaks. While the United States claims to have done a great job at reducing their carbon dioxide, their fracking and shale oil industry has increased methane emissions so much they've wiped out their greenhouse gas gains from carbon dioxide. Natural gas was considered a bridge fuel. Well, it turns out the bridge is to nowhere. But we also use natural gas in a lot of places where we need heat and power. Airports are a classic example. There's a lot of airports that have natural gas plants that provide electricity for the facilities, which are fairly electricity demanding, but also heat for the terminal. And so as we look at that, well, how much of that is going to continue? Well, my projection, natural gas cogeneration is going to disappear. There's multiple places where natural gas cogeneration is used. There's district heating systems, there's steam-assisted gravity drainage in the oil sands, there's airports. That's going to all go away, in part because heat pumps work much more efficiently for heating and cooling, and we're going to have renewables. It doesn't make sense to do cogeneration and create greenhouse gas emissions. Once again, the gas price fluctuations are changing the economics of that. Another big chunk that's used that a lot of people are considering is biomass. This is big in Northern Europe for legacy historical reasons. Cutting down old growth forests and burning them for heat or power is considered to be climate neutral. except they're destroying a biomass sink. This is a really weird thing out of Northern Europe, where they actually, in northern Germany and Denmark, what they're doing is they're having old forests in Finland and northern Sweden or in Canada or the United States cut down, pelletized into efficiently burning wood chunks, which means it's not scrap wood, and then trucked or shipped across oceans in many cases to be burned in Europe, and they are pretending that's climate neutral. I don't buy it personally, and I think they'll come to get a sense of reality on that. But still, biomass, there's a lot of scrap biomass out of the timber industry. We're not going to turn that all to paper mill into usable products. We're not going to turn all the scrap into biofuels, although that's an entirely viable pathway. So some biomass for electricity will be on the grid somewhere. I think it'll be smaller. It'll be fairly small plants where there happens to be a big supply of timber or something like that, which is reasonably dry. And the constraints there are obvious. I mean, it only makes sense when you've got a co-benefit of heat. And the constraints, we really shouldn't be cutting down forests unless they're going to durable wood products. The fact that we're cutting down the lungs of our planet to make chopsticks that we throw away once, or paper towels, it's not a great idea. And so we're going to start seeing more preservation of forests and less of a focus on biomass. It's just not as sensible a pathway as many people believe it. Now, there is an interesting edge case in agriculture where waste biomass is used for process heat for food, for certain classes of food preparation, like, for example, chili peppers, stuff like that. Most of those cases can be dealt with heat pumps, but if they've got a local supply of waste heat or waste biomass that would otherwise rot in middens and turn into methane because of anaerobic digestion, it's reasonable to use it for process heat in that space. But you got to be careful of that because the air pollution out of biomass is quite high. I always like to say that the worst form of heating for human health is a nearly recently dead tree. The amount of toxins that come out in wood smoke is remarkable. Now, nuclear generation, India's got a lot of nuclear. You've got a lot of CANDU reactors. I looked at the fleet. Most of them are in the 300 megawatt range. So arguably, India was building small modular nuclear reactors before small modular nuclear reactors were a thing. Now, in recent years, India has realized the same thing that everybody else realized, which is that small reactors aren't economic. It makes sense to get them up to the gigawatt scale. And so India has been building gigawatt scale reactors. And in the future, we're going to have nuclear generation. I just don't think we're going to have nearly as much of it as many people think. I think it's going to be under 5% of the global energy supply, which is more than it is today in terms of absolute numbers, but a lower percentage of electrical generation in relative numbers. And the reason for that is pretty simple. The graph on the left of the chart is a data set I've been tracking. I've been tracking a natural experiment in China of nuclear generation deployments versus renewables deployments. In 2014, somebody said to me, well, obviously nuclear can scale and renewables can't. And I said, that doesn't make any sense. We've got highly manufacturable items in wind turbines and solar panels that can have a massive global supply chain with low security risks and massively parallelized deployment. And then on the nuclear side, we have kind of gigawatt scale mega projects that can't be manufactured and put in shipping containers and shipped to the other side of the world and turned on with semi-skilled labor. And it didn't make sense to me that would be the case. And I looked around for a geography where the question could be answered by looking at what they were doing. Now, all the reasons that people in the West say that nuclear can't grow mostly don't apply to China. It should have been able to create all the conditions for success as a long-term stability of governance which enables, the nuclear programs to continue regardless of, electoral changes in the West, for example, where nuclear is sometimes a part of the wedge politics. It has a national scale program for deployment, has a national strategic requirement, has alignment with the development and maintenance of nuclear weapon capability, has the ability to do a national program for human resources, and it should have had the ability to pick a single design or two of technology to enable it to replicate its learning across all of its sites. In other words, they could have had all the conditions of success. However, China is much more than India, an export-driven country, and its strategy is based on that. And so instead, they built one of every nuclear technology and design so they can export anything any customer anywhere in the world wants. And as a result, their nuclear program is languishing badly. I still think it wouldn't have scaled nearly as quickly as renewables did, that white graph, and that is additional terawatt hours of actual generation with capacity factor added each year. As you can see, that's still an accelerating curve. It's going to accelerate for the next 10 or 15 years as well. Meanwhile, nuclear peaked in 2016 and 2018 with about 7 gigawatts of capacity, and it's been adding much less capacity since then. Last year, it only added 1.2 gigawatts of new capacity. And the question for India, because I'm sure this debate is strong in India, if China can't make the conditions for success for nuclear and renewables are so easy to build, which one should India be focusing on in the next few years? I certainly know which way I'm betting, and I'm not betting for nuclear. Now, here's where we get into the real, wedge things. So onshore wind farms, they need strong winds. They need a grid. It's going to be about 30% of all energy for the world, in my projection, will come from onshore wind farms. And some of them are pretty honking big, and we're getting to the point now where we're seeing quite large wind turbines on land. I think we're peaking at about 5 megawatts of capacity for an individual turbine. And when we repower old wind farms, we're getting a lot more power with a lot fewer wind turbines, getting higher capacity factors, lots of good stuff going on there. The generation is asynchronous. There was an experiment with synchronous wind turbines back in the 70s in the United States, which failed miserably. And so they ramp up and ramp down. Now, as I said, in the Electrify Everything Everywhere All the Time and previous discussions, one of the things that people don't realize about wind energy is that it's actually available about 85% of the time. It only has a capacity factor of perhaps 40%, which means of the, if we consider the wind blowing at perfect speed for all year long, that's 100%. Well, the wind doesn't blow at the perfect speed all year long. So the actual generation is 40% of the maximum generation. But that means that the wind actually blows between the startup speed and the cutoff speed 85% of the year. So even on the edge days, we're still getting a lot of electricity from wind. And one of the things that's in the short list is overbuild wind and solar. And the reason for that is that 85% and the roughly half of a day on average that solar is doing something, as we build up those 50% of generation of some sort from solar and 85% from wind, those curves start overlapping. We have built more of every form of generation except for nuclear than we could use, and then we've underused them, like coal plants running at under 50%, a lot of natural gas peaker plants running at under 10%. We don't have a problem with overbuilding generation and underutilizing it. And we're not going to have that problem with wind or solar as well, especially because it's cheaper than them. And, it's one of the nice things about wind and solar. They're cheap. Now, the co-benefits are interesting. So there's 2 or 3 things. From a flexibility perspective, wind turbines are really easy to turn off, and they're really easy to run below optimum and turn up. Simple SCADA commands from centralized grid management systems can easily manage wind assets to reduce their demand, generation when we need a little less on the grid, but also to run them at 90% of their optimal, and then have 10% in reserve to pop them up. Now, and that co-benefit comes with, we can reserve that for voltage and frequency power management solutions that are on wind farms as well. Now, right now, we're getting voltage and frequency support from big hunking, spinning chunks of metal in, steam coal plant turbines, in hydroelectric dams, and in nuclear plants. But we started requiring wind and solar farms to put on power management because they were so big that in order for them to be well-managed participants in the grid, we needed them to replicate that. And so increasingly, we're going to be able to get the co-benefits of voltage and frequency for the grid from wind farms, which are asynchronous, but we're now allowing electronics to do that. So they become much more flexible participants in the grid. Remember, they're running 85% of the time, just below maximum. We can run them at 90% of what the weather conditions might enable them. And that gives us immediate free backup that can be turned on electronically. This is just a market requirement. The constraints are wind, and wind conditions do change over the year and over the day, and that varies a lot by geography. So, it's not a slam dunk. It's a great participant in the grid, and it is not the only participant in the grid. Now, offshore wind has some advantages that onshore wind doesn't. The winds are a lot steadier, and they're a lot firmer, closer to the water. So the masts don't have to be as tall. And the logistics of offshore means wind turbines can be massive. China's putting in place, I think it's a 20 or 21 gigawatt single turbine this year. Given they used to start out, they started out under a megawatt, over 20 megawatt single turbine is an astounding thing. And that's easy because we can put them on ships. We don't have to drive them along highways and get them under bridges and stuff like that. We can put them on ships where there's many fewer logistical constraints. Now, same advantages, asynchronous, easily feathered. One of the constraints is subsea transmission, but we've solved that problem. High voltage direct current interlinks are now regularly done everywhere in the world. For offshore wind, the break-even point is 50 kilometers for high voltage direct current versus high voltage alternating currents due to the characteristics of the power management solution. And then one of the nice things about offshore winds is frequently they can be put a lot closer to major demand centers. While the United States has very specific constraints on its offshore wind because of Jones Act that prevents maritime shipping from being sensibly managed for historical reasons. And so they're really constrained in terms of putting offshore wind in there. And they've got billionaires with compounds who just don't want to have a hint of a wind turbine, on the horizon. We've got a couple of headwinds there. If they could put offshore wind off of New York State, and they could be providing enormous amounts of electricity at times when it's demanded for their biggest demand center of population when it's needed. And so that's why they keep trying despite the headwinds. So offshore wind is going to be big. It's understated. If we look at Japan, it actually has very significant offshore wind capabilities. It's just not building them sensibly. It's doing silly stuff. It's talking about importing ammonia and co-burning it with coal, which is going to be 9 times the cost of energy. And so it will bankrupt their economy if they actually persist in going down that pathway. And so, offshore wind is going to be a big part. And then, of course, solar farms, utility scale solar farms, my projection, 35%, the biggest single form of electrical generation. 10 years ago, I thought that wind might have the edge on solar. now I know that from the evidence of the past decade, we put solar panels in containers, we ship them around the world, and they're easy to install everywhere. There's this great video out of China, out of heavy lift drones, plucking massive solar panels off a stack and flying them autonomously down to their location on a hillside solar farm somewhere in Western China. It's astounding to watch. The scale is right for human interaction and containerization, which is a strong benefit. And they have all the advantages of wind. As I said, it's in New Delhi, where many of the participants are today. Right now, it's about 12 hours of sunshine a day, which means 12 hours of solar generation, just not at peak. And so if there's more solar farms, you get more electricity in the edge conditions, and it's easily turned off. We can turn off strings of solar panels in a solar farm, once again, with the same SCADA commands that we use for wind turbines. So once again, we can run solar farms suboptimally and turn on capacity if we've overbuilt solar. And so there's a really interesting advantage. Or we can do things where we can actually load balance for putting heat into heat storage, for doing some industrial processes that require lots of electricity in the right time when peak solar is done. There's some great flexibility with solar and wind that doesn't exist with nuclear or coal, which is underestimated as an advantage. But of course, if it's cloudy, we get less electricity. If it's nighttime, we get no electricity. So what? Everything's got some constraints. Now, commercial solar is going to be a big thing. Like every country has big boxes, warehouses. It has distribution centers for a modern distribution-based economy. And those things have big flat roofs. Convention centers frequently have big flat roofs. There's lots of commercial buildings where there's lots of rooftops available for slapping on solar. And similarly with car parks, any place where there's parking lots as they exist in North America are much rarer in the rest of the world. But there's big expanses around malls in North America where there should be solar protecting the cars from sunlight and, oh, by the way, generating the electricity that goes into the cars. It's going to be 2 to 3% of the global generation mix, in my estimation, among other things, because it puts electrical generation where there is significant demand. Distribution centers are increasingly going to have electric trucks rolling in and out. They're going to need big batteries. And so what's going to feed the big batteries that buffer that stuff? Well, a lot of that is going to be rooftop solar. We don't need nearly as much grid if we've got more demand centers coated in solar panels. And so, that's a big wedge, and it's, an obvious one. I've, dealt with a whole bunch of commercial solar developers who do very well for themselves because of this. The fall in solar panel prices these days globally, it's a no-brainer. Residential solar, quite a different story, 2 to 3%. Now, I've had this debate with Mark Jacobson out of Stanford. He and his team since the early 2000s have been developing a model for 100% renewables by 2050. He's one of the most influential people speaking about what the grid will look like in the future. He and I disagree on stuff, but it's matters of degree, not of kind. So Mark thinks that rooftop solar between commercial and residential will be 15% of energy in the future. I think it's going to be 5 to 8% between them, and for a simple reason. We're not going to mandate that everybody have solar on their roofs. It doesn't make a lot of sense to do that. There's a lot of rooftops that are shaded. There's a lot of rooftops that aren't aligned well with the sun. There's a lot of rooftops that, people just want solar on. And to be clear, Mark is a brilliant, great guy. I have a lot of time for him. We've spent a lot of time together. But he lives in the suburbs of affluent California in a ranch home with a huge roof. in a sunshine state. And so his perspective is bound by his conditions. Now, I spent a lot more time in Asia, I think in Latin America than Mark. Had leadership roles in Latin America and Singapore, and I traveled extensively around Asia and Latin America. Most people don't live in suburban ranch homes with massive roofs for a family of 3 or 4. It's not that way. Asia, 90% of people live in multi-unit residential buildings, and those have much less ability to put solar on the rooftop to provide the power for the residents of the multi-unit residential building. I live more like an Asian person. I'm in a 19-story condo building with 233 units, probably 400 residents. That's much more Asian than North American. And so I tend to have a different perspective, but it's pretty good. Now, geothermal. I like to describe geothermal as a place where it's really useful if you've a constant threat of having your country destroyed by earthquakes or volcanoes. Iceland and New Zealand, I spent 6 weeks in New Zealand last year. I describe them as collections of volcanoes that are temporarily dormant. And so, at some point, they're just going to be wiped out by the equivalent of Krakatoa. But in the meantime, they've got great access to geothermal electricity. The constraints of geothermal, I think, are going to leave it at about 1% of global energy generation. There are places like Japan which should be leveraging their geothermal, and British Columbia, where I live, that should be leveraging geothermal, where different preconditions means we aren't. In Japan, the onsen culture means hot springs are sacrosanct in their culture, and you can't touch them for geothermal generation. In British Columbia, we have very few people. We have lots and lots of hydroelectricity, so we don't really need to do geothermal. We should be doing more of it. And so I don't think it's going to be a huge thing. And I'm not actually that big on deep geothermal, the modern deep geothermal. There's risks there that I think are underappreciated. Tidal electricity, there's going to be some generation, but it's going to be less than 1,000th of global energy needs. It's just, people don't appreciate how hard it is to keep something operating underwater with moving parts. Offshore wind works great because there's no moving parts underwater. Everything that's underwater is just a wire or concrete or steel. And it's coated steel so it doesn't corrode. And it just accrues minerals and wildlife. So I don't think tidal is going to be very big. I'm including it here for completeness. Now, there's one exception here that's worth talking about. Like everything else is going to be grid tied. So the grid can act as a battery, a demand center and a supply center, at least part of the time. A lot of generation that's on the grid is there to supply the electricity with that the grid needs. The rooftop solar and commercial solar that's not on rooftops, well, that's still going to be almost entirely grid tied. It doesn't make sense to not have it grid tied. You get a lot of benefits from the grid, like voltage and frequency control and the backup, a whole lot of other benefits that you don't get if you're not attached to the grid. And so the grid remains an integral component of this. And one of the challenges around generation is everybody seems to think that the wires don't matter and that they don't need to be paid for. That's just not the case. Utilities have a purpose, and that purpose is to maintain the wires, and the wires need to be paid for, and that's completely reasonable. Conversations where people say, well, you've got to get rid of the utilities, I just kind of scratch my head and think, have you ever actually looked at the way that electricity gets around? But mining is an exception. A lot of mining is in remote areas where it doesn't make sense to string a wire 1,000 kilometers. It makes sense to put up a 6 gigawatt solar farm for the duration of the mine, and then rip the solar farm down and put it up next to the next mine, which is what's happening in Australia. And a lot of them places, they have lots of room for wind. I worked on a engagement briefly where we were putting 3 big wind turbines up in northern Quebec on a mining site in Raglan. It made a lot of sense. It avoids having to ship in a lot of diesel or other energy. And to be clear, the mining giants have kind of all agreed on this. Rio Tinto, Fortescue, BHP, I think another one, Vale, have all said they're going to electrify their mines. That's the pathway to the future. They're going to build a lot of renewables close to the mines where it's viable. They're going to run transmission to the mines. If it's not, it just makes sense. It's the most efficient way to do it. And it's increasingly the most economically viable one. Now, the next one is grid storage. We just have lots of places we're going to put grid storage. And I think I'll say is that grid storage can be anywhere that it makes sense. One of the few coming lectures in this seminar series is just all about storage and a discussion of India, where there's a lot more capacity for closed loop off-river storage than the Indian perspective appears to believe. And I'm curious to explore that. But battery storage, they've plummeted in price so much. They're showing up on microgrids. They're showing up in commercial facilities and distribution centers. They're showing up in places where instead of strengthening the wires, the transmission or distribution, it makes sense to put a buffering battery at either end to optimize that physical asset of the wire. And so we're seeing a lot of that stuff, and it's increasingly be thought of as a form of generation because it provides so many different pieces of capacity. And then, of course, there's heat. Heat pumps, whether ground source, air source, or water source, are moving units of energy out of the environment into the places we need them. And so they're using electricity to do that, but the efficiency is astounding. We end up with the ability to use a lot less energy for the same value proposition. So we don't need to generate nearly as much electricity. And there's a lot of thermal storage that can balance stuff around as we move in a 24-hour period. So there's some significant advantages to thinking of environmental heat as an energy source in this context. Now, of course, this is all running around increasing on high voltage direct current stuff. Now we've got reconductoring. I'll be talking about reconductoring and Heimdall smart balls and high voltage direct current in another seminar series. All of them, all the grids are going to have a lot of different types of generation. And this isn't a reliability issue. The grids in the world with the highest penetration of renewables, like Germany and Denmark, for example, Germany is an industrialized nation. It's a high demand nation, and it gets 60% of its electricity from renewables these days. Its national global greenhouse gas emissions have plummeted by 10% over the past couple of years, and it's accelerating decarbonization with cheaper electricity. Their wholesale electricity prices are among the lowest in Europe. They maintain artificially high electricity prices, just as they maintain artificially high fossil fuel prices to incentivize efficiency, and it works. But now they've got to tweak that and make electricity cheaper and fossil fuel more expensive so that they can get more people to electrify. So that's the slides. Got a few minutes for questions. I don't have a hard stop. Reggie, I will take it over to you to moderate the questions.
Thank you. We have very few questions. Only one participant asked 2 questions. One is about, he's saying there is too much of investment has been done already on the coal plants. So why don't we concentrate more on making the coal energy cleaner? So that's one question. So you can see it on the comment. Yeah. Why is not
Sure.
world more?
Yeah. So there has been a lot of attempts to try to pretend that coal can be clean. All coal can be is less filthy. If we take the consideration of supercritical coal plants burning high-grade washed coal, and low sulfur coal, they can get down to the point where they're only killing 40 or so people a year per plant. They can get down to the point where they're only causing significant health degradation in population, in a smaller portion of the population, as opposed to we're seeing 7.5 to 12 million people a year having significantly degraded quality of life, productivity, and lifespan. Part of the reason that China is so focused on renewables and clean energy and has shut down so many coal plants is because they were seeing in northern China 12-year reductions in lifespan. their life expectancy was being degraded by coal generation. And that's why when I talk about China and coal, I say, well, they have replaced a lot of their brown coal plants that were running, in just crappy ways. They've replaced them with supercritical plants with low sulfur washed coal that are running very efficiently. But still, that's taking, from a climate perspective, 1,400 kilograms, 1.4 tons per megawatt hour of carbon dioxide from the worst coal plants, only down to about 800 kilograms, 0.8 tons, from one of the new supercritical coal plants. It's not clean. It's not low carbon. It is not a pathway to the future. The new supercritical plants are slightly more flexible, so they can be treated more as peak regeneration, and that's probably necessary. But there's no way to make coal clean or low carbon. It's basically carbon-rich dirt, and it's carbon-rich dirt with mercury and other trace elements that end up in the environment and end up in our children and end up in the biosphere, end up in bioaccumulating stuff. So it's really hard to actually bolt stuff onto an existing coal plant to deal with this. Now, many people have tried. Boundary Dam in Saskatchewan attempted to bolt a carbon capture and sequestration solution onto their existing coal plant. After a few years of operation, they found a few things. One is, for many of the years, they'd only achieved 40% capture, well below the expectation. Second, they were using the carbon captured for enhanced oil recovery, pumping it down into tapped old oil wells to liquefy the sludge that's left over, pressurize it, and enable it to be sucked out, and then burned. And every time you pump a ton of carbon dioxide into an oil well for that purpose, you get about 0.2 to 1 tons of new petroleum, which when you burn it, negates the benefits of sequestering CO2. So that's kind of thing two. Thing three is, what they found is it made the electricity from Boundary Dam incredibly expensive. It was $140 per megawatt hour for coal generation, which is supposed to be cheap. And so what Saskatchewan did after that experiment was said, okay, we've tried it. It doesn't work economically, and we're not going to ever do it again. Now, if you go down to, I think it was Petronova in southern United States, they attempted something similar. What they did is they had, I think, 12 generation units in a massive coal facility. So they had 12 boilers, and they bolted on carbon capture to one of them. And so they bolted on that carbon capture to one of the 12 generations. They had to build a natural gas plant to power the carbon capture, because the auxiliary power drain of carbon capture, compression, and dealing with the carbon dioxide, which in the case of coal is over three times the mass of the coal that you put in, was a very big drain. Now, they claimed, the carbon capture and sequestration community claimed that was a success. They managed to get up to 93% capture for 1 month, but mostly like Boundary Dam, it failed miserably to achieve its carbon capture objectives. It made the electricity incredibly expensive, and built a natural gas plant to provide the power with the right characteristics to run carbon capture. It doesn't make any sense. It's just a declining pathway to thermodynamic, economic, and climate idiocy. So I don't have any temperament that allows me to think of making coal cleaner is a solution. Using coal plants less is a solution. If coal is required, replacing your worst coal plants with a supercritical coal plant with low sulfur, washed, high-grade coal is a solution as you reduce the capacity factor of your coal plants. But the real answer is not build more coal if at all possible. And so for India, the question is, what's that narrow pathway? If we think of the guide rails, how do you get as close to no coal, or what's the minimum coal that you can manage to build and manage to operate in the thing? Because there's so many health impacts for your citizens. There's so many productivity impacts from the health impacts. You know, you need a productive labor force. You need a healthy environment for your people to live in. Coal does none of that. It kills people. And now it generates electricity. In the absence of anything else, coal is better than nothing else. But we have alternatives now, and they're cheaper. So hope that helps.
So before we get into the next question, request everybody to switch on your camera. Let's have a group photo. So last time we couldn't do that. I'll request everybody to stop sharing the screen, bring everybody on the screen, request everyone to switch on your cameras. Let's have a group photo. Sneha, you will take the picture?
Yes, sir.
It will be in two screens, but yeah. Indian coal has a huge, Indian coal has very high sulfur content. But about 6 years ago, our Central Electricity Regulatory Commission mandated all thermal power stations in the country to install desulfurization units. So far nobody has done it for various reasons. They allowed also, no, even now we don't find many of them with the camera on. There are only 50% people. So group photo will not look good. Many of our ISGF colleagues are also not switching on the cameras. Do that.
Well, everybody's like saying, oh no, I have to move to a place with a backdrop. I can't have my dirty dishes behind me. Oh, I have to do my hair. Oh, I'm not wearing a shirt. Yeah. I better put on a shirt.
Done, Sneha? Oh,
Yes,
second screen, yes, hardly anybody. No, second screen has more people. Okay, so what I was telling, back to the question, if you are done, back to the questions. So Indian coal has high sulfur content. It's not suitable for even carbon capture and storage, even if the technology has matured. So the desulfurization unit was approved by our central regulator, and several people calculated different number. Just before COVID, someone calculated that a plant which generates electricity at 2 rupees or 2.5 rupees, the desulfurization unit will add another 40 to 45 paise per kilowatt hour, and nobody was willing to buy into that. It was kind of 20-25% increase in the price of power. So nothing has been done so far. Now that storage technologies have become, battery storage has become much cheaper compared to many other technologies. Last 2 years, ISGF has been arguing that we should not spend that billions of dollars on desulfurization plants or installing desulfurization unit on thermal power stations, which anyway we are going to retire after some years. So instead, we should invest that money into building distributed storage on the grid, by which we can integrate more solar and wind. So moving on to the next question. Bala, please project the screen. I can read out, I guess. Yeah, or yeah, this again from same participant. No, to the previous questions, not this.
Sagar, you can stop this. Devat, you can stop. I will share.
Yeah, so he is asking, you suggested, Michael, 35% of that global power mix will be solar. So he says that with so much uncertainty about the sunshine, how can we be so sure that 35% contribution of total power in future will be from solar? Over to you, Michael.
I'm feeling like we've missed. There we go. Number 2. There we go.
Yeah, number 2.
So 2 or 3 things related to this question. So yes, solar doesn't work at night, and in heavy evening loads, there isn't solar power. Well, time shifting solar a few hours is easy using 2 different simple common technologies. The first is India is, well, not one of the biggest countries. It's not Russia, it's not China, it's not the United States. It's still the 7th biggest country in the world, and that includes east to west. So sunshine that's hitting the west coast of India in a low demand period can be transmitted across India to high demand centers in the east. And similarly, that you are in a geography where you actually have neighbors, and transmission can flow to your neighbors, so you can actually be transmitting peak solar across greater geographical distances. You're already doing some of that. That's going to expand. The second thing is, it's easy to put a lot of solar energy into increasingly cheap batteries and shift the electricity a few hours into the evening. So we're seeing that increasingly occur in affluent countries that we're starting that. But battery prices are plummeting. It's even surprised me. Everybody's been surprised by how much battery prices are going down. I've been saying that in 2020s, not betting on batteries is like around 2000 not betting on fiber optics and data availability or wireless and data availability. Similar kind of constraint. The constraint is a temporary one based upon an apparent lack. Right now we're seeing CATL projecting delivery of batteries at $56 per kilowatt hour of capacity. That's a price point that wasn't expected to be achieved until 2030 by people who are actually optimistic about batteries. We're also seeing massive numbers of new things. And then there's the other forms of grid storage. I'll be talking more about both grid storage and transmission in subsequent lectures. So the sunshine hours availability, as I said in New Delhi, it's 12 hours of generation. If we overbuild 25%, that actually accommodates most of our shoulder needs. And we can move the peak of sunshine a bit and actually then collaborate with wind and the other forms of generation that are on the grid to provide that power that we need. So it's not that actually hard. Hope that answers the question.
There are two questions on hydrogen. So I wish to tell the participants who asked that question, we will have a full session on hydrogen in the series. So we will not spend time on that. Then another question here is on the right optimal mix of sustainable RE capacity and technology deployment. So over to you on this question number 4, Michael.
So there's people who've done this kind of work, and there's lots of different scenarios. I encourage people to go to explore them. Mark said Jacobson has a perspective on India. As I said, he leans too heavily into rooftop solar from my perspective, but he's in the ballpark. So you can look at his projections of transmission, wind, solar, and water, and get a pretty good answer there. It's Mark said Jacobson, Stanford University, 100% renewables by 2050. His models now extend to, I think it's 145 countries globally. Because he reruns them with CIA fact book data for every country and lots of good biomass stuff. Does very sophisticated modeling. It's not perfect, but it's a plausible scenario that's worth looking at. India has also got a future-oriented grid strategy that it's articulated. I disagree with aspects of it. It's a bit too heavy on. I think it's when I reviewed it briefly. There's some hydrogen in there, which is a dead end, and we'll be discussing why. There's a bit too much focus on nuclear, and there's too much of a reliance on fossil fuels. There's an underappreciation of the value propositions of renewable energy, which is fairly typical for some of these legacy things. Some of these big strategic documents are subject to extensive lobbying and legacy thinking, which doesn't necessarily keep up with the